Hello everyone, Neil Tappin here from Golf Monthly, and welcome to a new video series in which we are taking an in-depth look at the equipment that is being used out on the European Tour. In this series, we're not looking quite so much at what individual players are using, but more at trends that are happening across the board. So to help us with that, we've teamed up with Sports Marketing Surveys, and they are the guys that stand on the first tee of every single European Tour event, and they go to the golf bags of every single player in that field and they log exactly what that player is using. So they take off all the head covers, they find out the specs of all the clubs from driver all the way down to putter, and actually that includes some of the apparel as well that players are wearing. And what we wanted to do was take that data to find out if there were any trends there, firstly to see if we could shed any light on what's going on out on tour under competition conditions, but also to see whether there was anything that we could learn, any nuggets of information out there for average amateur golfers about how they might be able to set up their own equipment a little bit better. So in this first video, we are looking at wedge trends on the European Tour, and for that we've taken the data from the KLM Open. Earlier on this summer, KLM Open held at the Dutch golf course over there in Holland. There were 156 players in the field, and of that 156, there were 559 wedges in play. And the first question we wanted to look at, obviously, were more players carrying 4 wedges or were more players carrying 3? And a quick look at the data revealed that 92 players were using 4 wedges and 64 players were using 3. So heavily, I'd say fairly heavily in favour of 4 wedges. Now what you're looking at here is a grid that reveals how wedge usage has changed over the years at the KLM Open. So in 2005, I know it's a different venue, but it does reveal an important story. In 2005, there were 150 players in the field using 463 wedges. That went up in 2010 to 496 wedges, through to this year coming in at 559 wedges. Which means that back in 2005, very, very few players were using more than 3 wedges. Now, the majority of players are using 4, and there are a few really important reasons for that. Firstly, players are hitting the ball further. The Distance in Golf report that was delivered by the RNA at the end of 2017 revealed that players were 2% longer in 2017 than they were in 2003. It might not be a huge amount of difference, but what that means that if your 9-iron is a little bit longer than it used to be, then you're going to need potentially more wedges at the bottom end of the bag. The other thing to say is that lofts through the iron sets are definitely stronger nowadays than they were back in 2005. So it's been a trend that we've seen when you're fitting players on a launch monitor. The equipment manufacturers know there is a quick and easy gain to be had by strengthening the lofts and showing people on a launch monitor that they're hitting the ball further. Now, they've been able to do that by moving the centre of gravity back. It's something we say a lot on our equipment reviews. So you're still seeing the ball flight the same. So a 7-iron is still flying in the way that you would expect a 7-iron to be flying, except that it's going further. And this creates a problem at the bottom end of the bag, because if a 9-iron is stronger now than it was 5 years ago, a few degrees, then that means potentially you might need to carry an extra wedge in the bag. To give you an idea, I'd say that over the last 5 years, the average 7-iron has been strengthened by around 2 degrees, and that is providing quite a significant extra amount of yardage for that club. There is a club on the market in 2018 from Callaway. It's called the Rogue X. That has a 7-iron of 27 degrees. Now, this is a trend that will be less prevalent out on tour, because the irons that are being used by the players out on tour are more traditionally set lofts. They might not be quite so strong, but there is without doubt a trend towards producing clubs that go further, and part of that is lofts that are slightly stronger. And the other thing to mention is course setup. So what we see very often out on the European Tour and on the PGA Tour is golf courses that look very green. This is because the golf course will look better on TV, and it means that players can hit driver more often because they don't have fear of losing control of the golf ball. When you looked at Carnoustie, for instance, this summer, the golf course was very firm, very brown, very fast and running, and that takes control away from the players, and therefore they have to be more strategically minded. Whereas if the golf course is very lush and very green, they can kind of throw darts at it, hit driver, bomb it away, and that means now with the ball going so far that they potentially need more wedges in the bag at the bottom end. Now, the next thing I want to put out from the data was how many players were using the set pitching wedge from their set of irons, and the numbers were really high, higher than I expected. So 105 of the 156 players in the field were using their set pitching wedge. So very few, relatively few specialist wedges lofted between 46 and 49 degrees. So 52 players in the field were using a specialist pitching wedge. Having said that, I guess looking back at the data, if you went back 5 years, there would be very few players using a specialist pitching wedge. So that number has gone up a lot, I suspect, over the last 5 years, and is perhaps a trend worth looking out for in the future. The next thing to look at is lob wedges. Now, every single player in the field was carrying a lob wedge apart from one, and that was Aaron Rye. So everyone was carrying a wedge of 58 degrees or more. I think actually there might have been one player with a 57 degree wedge. Aaron Rye's most lofted wedge was 56. But apart from him, everybody else was carrying a lob wedge. But having said that, not one single player had more loft on their wedges than 60. So 60 was the most used specialist wedge loft. I think there were 85 players were using a 60 degree wedge, but nobody was using anything more than that. So no 62 or 64 wedges, which again, I was quite surprised about, given how much of an emphasis there has been on that in recent times from the equipment manufacturers. Now, having looked at the data, I think it's fair to say there is no such thing as a typical wedge lineup on tour. Every player hits the ball slightly different distances. Every player will have different things that they're looking to do within their short game. And so the loft lineups are very different across the board. However, if I had to pick a typical 4-wedge lineup, what I'm going to do is show you the lineup of Matthew Southgate. So he was using what I would describe as close to a typical wedge lineup as you can find for 4 wedges. So he's using the Titleist 718 MB pitching wedge. He has a dynamic gold shaft in that, and then he goes into the Titleist Vokey SM7. He has a 50 degree, 54 and a 58. So Matthew Southgate is working roughly towards a 4 degree gap on each of his wedges at the bottom end of his bag, and that's going to equate to roughly even distance gaps at the bottom end of his bag, which makes pitching that little bit easier to do. Of the 3 wedge players, I'd say a typical one was Thomas Detry. He is a Callaway man, so he's using Callaway Apex MB irons. He has Project X 6.5 shafts in those, so he's using the pitching wedge from his set. Then he goes into a Callaway Mac Daddy 4 52 degree wedge into a 58 degree wedge. So he was working towards a 6 degree difference between the wedges in his bag, roughly. It's hard to say because we don't know exactly what the loft of that pitching wedge was, but roughly 6 degree difference between each of his wedges at the bottom end of his bag. And I think there's an important point there for anyone looking to set their own wedges up. It's a good idea to have as even gaps as possible. It's a general rule of thumb. Have even gaps between the clubs at the bottom end of your bag. That's going to help you hit the right numbers more consistently. Obviously, those players with 3 wedges in the bag, that gives them more options at the other end of the bag. So you'll find that likes of Thomas Detry and other players carrying 3 wedges, they'll have an extra fairway wood in the bag or an extra long iron in the bag to help them with that part of the game. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was take a look at the wedges of the winner of the KLM Open. Ashen Wu won the tournament. He's a Strixon Cleveland player, so he's using Strixon irons. So he had the Strixon Z745 set pitching wedge in the bag, and then he went into Cleveland RTX3 wedges. He had a 54 degree and a 58 degree. Now, an important point to pull out is that the KLM Open at the Dutch golf course, this is not one of the longest golf courses on tour. So the tour average distance out on tour is 7,278. The Dutch was coming in at 6,983, so a little bit less than the tour average. Of course, there are a few golf courses at altitude that will slightly skew the numbers, adding a little bit of extra yardage, but I think it's fair to say the Dutch comes in a little bit under that yardage, so perhaps would suit those players that did have 3 wedges in the bag. I think there's something to be said for that. However, as I said at the beginning, a wedge lineup is very much like your own fingerprint. And I think from looking at the data, a trend would be that the longer players in the field were mostly, I'd say mostly carrying 4 wedges, whereas the shorter players in the field were mostly carrying 3 wedges. That is a bit of a generalisation. There were certainly some exceptions to that, Soren Kjeldsen being one of those. He definitely not one of the longest players on the European Tour. He was carrying 4 wedges. The idea there being that if you have more wedges in the area of the bag that you're strongest, you're giving yourselves the most options that can really make a difference to your game. I know that Henrik Stenson likes to carry an extra club at the top end of his bag because that's where he's strongest. It's horses for courses, really. Different players will have different ideas on that. Certainly you'll have different ideas on how you want to set up your wedges. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Please do leave comments below. Let us know whether you carry 3 or 4 wedges, and let us know why. So give us the reasons why you feel like 3 or 4 wedges is right for your game. We'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. Likewise, if you have any more questions about the data, please do fire them in and we'll be happy to get back to you. Guys, thank you very much for watching, but from now, for West Hill, it's goodbye.